Um, Today's message will be for fathers. Today's message will be about some of the fathers we see in Scripture. It will be, on one side, an encouragement to fathers. It may be to others a call to change. For those of you that are not fathers yet, it'll be just something to think about what your fathers may have went through to show that appreciation, or maybe for some of you it'll be a call to be this kind of father. So I really want to make sure that if you're sitting here, you're like, well, I'm not a dad because I'm a girl. Listen here and think about, man, I want to show appreciation to my dad because he would have went through a lot of this. Being a dad is it's a little different from being a mom, right? There's a story, one of my favorites, about a woman, a mom, a wife, that made the mistake of leaving her baby alone with the dad. Anybody here ever made that mistake, ladies? And you're like, oh no, never happening again. Until you're exhausted, and then you're like, all right, take the baby, take it. So she leaves the baby with the husband, and the husband obviously, the moment she walks out of the room, yeah, I'll take care of her, and he's immediately back to doing whatever he was doing. Completely forgets about the baby until all of a sudden he hears a series of thunk, 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 thunk. And he realizes the baby's gotten way too close to the steps. And all of a sudden, knowing that the baby's crying, obviously, he's like, oh my goodness, the wife is going to find out. So obviously, to turn the situation around, he says, honey, come here. Our baby just took her first 24 steps. You've got to figure it out. Right, dads? Being a dad is a little different, A couple of quotes I ran across this week from dads. He said, never thought fatherhood would place me on top of a ladder getting a diaper that had gotten caught in the ceiling fan. Yet here I am. It happens. One dad says, teaching my kids to eat healthy is basically me saying to them, it's too late for me, save yourself. Dad's favorite saying is, what's that horrible smell in the room? And then one dad says, at this stage, parenting is mostly a long string of accidentally saving my child's life. And I think that was so true for me. My dad, he could sit down and he could be like, oh, I remember we were doing construction on the house, and then like that 4x4 fell and almost nailed you, and luckily you were just standing in the right spot where, he could walk down the list of things. Well, man, remember that time you almost got ran over by a lawnmower? A good thing I was there. So, true story. We're all lucky to be here. Thank you, Lord, and thank you for our parents that saved us in those moments. Being a dad has its own level of responsibility. We understand and have that feeling, and I say we, not because I'm a dad, but obviously, thinking about the future, but men in general, men, I'm speaking to you, there is that responsibility that the Bible places on us, that Scripture, God places on us naturally in the natural world of being the protector, of being the provider for the family, of being the rock, of being somebody who's there, who takes care of things. There is that weight and responsibility that lies on us men. We know that when we stand before the Lord, we will answer. Right? There's an hierarchy of authority, and the authority comes from Jesus down to the men in the family, right? The husbands, and then down to the wives and the kids. That's the way it comes down. And so we have that responsibility. But what happens when something fails? What happens when something fails in just the physical world, in the natural world, where no matter how much you've tried, you've worked so hard, you've figured it out. You've paid for the bank accounts. You've gotten the bills paid, the house mortgage. You think everything's fine. You're sending your kids to good schools, right? You've bought them a bicycle helmet. You've got them insured. Everything seems to be like, all right, I think we're provided for. We've got a vacation coming up. And then something happens that's outside of your control. We work so hard, men, to provide for the family, to take care of things, and then when something happens, maybe there's a sickness, maybe there's an accident. No matter how much you've tried, No matter how great of an individual you are, famous or rich or just really good at what you do, pain equalizes everybody. Sorrow humanizes the great. What happens when something breaks down spiritually? We're called to be spiritual leaders, and then you find out, oh my goodness, my poor girl, she's addicted. My boy that I thought, I did everything for him, and now he hates the family, and he's trying to run away, and he's got all these emotional issues. What did we do wrong? What did I do wrong as a father? What happens in those moments when everything breaks down? And that's what I want to speak to today, the faith of our fathers, and look at three very specific stories in the gospel. Three very specific stories of three fathers and how they communicated to Jesus, how they went to the Lord about their kids. And so if you will, we're going to begin in John. We're going to begin in John, the faith of our fathers. Many of you are here because your fathers displayed this faith. Many of you will display this faith as fathers, and so that's why we're going to study this. And so, again, in John chapter 4, I'm going to do this chronologically. This story happens early on in Jesus' ministry, very, very early on. You'll read in John, he gets baptized, he's in Judea for a little bit, and then he's going to come up to Galilee, where this story happens. The father was this official from Capernaum, and you're going to see that whole map here in a second. This is a test that Jesus places on these men, testing faith in fatherhood. He's going to test these three men in specific ways, and the first test, if you will, on the slideshow is the test of obedience. The test of obedience. I'll give you guys a second. Test of obedience. There we go. Testing faith in fatherhood, testing faith in obedience. And you've got the passage there, John 4:46, if we will. Let's read it together. And at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. I'm going to pause here for a second because I want us to recognize the story behind this. Jesus just started his ministry. He comes up out of Galilee, which is down south in Israel. He comes up north to Cana. This man, if you look at the map, I think I've got a map here for you guys. Capernaum is all the way there, almost on the north shore of Galilee. Cana is more in the central part of Galilee. That's an 18-mile walk. And we see here, he went to him himself. He heard that Jesus was coming up. He would have possibly known about Jesus because Jesus was, again, Nazareth is not too far from Capernaum. They would have probably known about this guy that's beginning to preach. And he hears about Jesus and the miracles that he's starting to do. He would have heard about Jesus' first miracle, which happened in Cana. Again, that's just a day's walk away. And so he hears about Jesus, and this man who was an official, he was a government official. So think about, how we say the Trump administration or the Obama administration, right? So somebody who's part of the administration. Well, he was part of Herod's administration. He was stationed in Capernaum, a high-ranking official that walks a day to get to Jesus. Verse 48, so Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. He comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, heal my boy. And Jesus says, I need to stop you for a second. I've got a feeling you're here. You heard about that miracle at the wedding. You might have been there yourself. Maybe you enjoyed the wine. But are you here just because you need to see another miracle? Testing him for his obedience. He says, are you just here for the miracles, or is there more to your request? I'm not here just to do party tricks. Where is your faith? And it seems like it's such a tough answer. The guy's boy is ill. Just help him out. But no, Jesus pushes back and says, I need to test you here for obedience. What are you here really for? Do you really believe, or are you just looking at me as if I'm just another doctor in maybe a long line of doctors that you've brought to your child? And the official says to him, verse 49, "Sir, come down before my child dies." And Jesus says to him, "Go, your son will live." So he says, "No, just please come heal him. I believe." And he says, "All right, I'm going to test you. I'm going to test you for obedience. Go, and your son will live." Folks, if you went to a doctor, maybe it's something like chemo, something just completely terrible, or maybe it's surgery or medication, and the guy is like, hey, don't worry about the surgery. You just go on home now. Everything will be all right. Like, hey, yeah, we don't have to take your appendix out. You go on home and it'll be good. My brother had a ruptured appendix. I mean, it almost killed him. I thank God that he's alive today. But I promise, when he went to the hospital, they're like, "You get in here. We need to put some hands on you. We need to cut this open and wash all this out." Jesus is like, no. You go on. It'll be good. If it was another doctor, you sue him. That's malpractice. He's killing somebody. But if you're standing in front of the Son of God, you believe what he says. If you thought this was just another doctor, like Jesus was testing him, do you think I'm just a doctor? Do you think I'm something different? And he says, "No, I don't think you're just a doctor. I do believe. I will obey." And so we read the beautiful thing. The man believed the words that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. If you believe that's Jesus, that it's the Son of God in front of you, you absolutely trust and obey what he says, because he's more than a doctor. I love how Jesus, to this man's request, instead of a miracle, he gives him a promise. Instead of a solution, he gives him a roadmap. Instead of an answer, he asks for his obedience. He says, "Do you trust my word? Are you ready to obey, Dad? Are you ready to obey me first? I know you've got a pressing need, but are you ready to obey me first?" I think any believer dad has been through something like this, where God calls for your obedience. And if you haven't, you will. I'll use an illustration of my own dad. I might have shared it before once or twice, but the story of how he came into ministry is pretty crazy to me. And he shares that as part of his testimony. He says, "Man, I didn't hear him speak once, so he had to speak to me several times." He used to, when we first moved to the United States, he spoke barely any English. He was embarrassed to do food stamps, so he literally went to English school for 3 months, picked up as much English as he could, and became a truck driver. And did very, very well. Very hardworking guy. And so as the years went on, he's actually owned his own transportation company. The issue was he was doing long-haul work. So at one point we moved to the East Coast, and so he was doing Virginia to LA, back to Virginia, up to Massachusetts, so it was this Massachusetts LA route that he ran, which took him out of church for during the weeks, and it took him away from the family other than on the weekends. But he made it work for as long as he could. But then he said things started to happen. On one side, he hears that call. He says, "I've never thought I would go into ministry, but man, now I'm a youth pastor or a youth leader, and I'm being called to minister more and more. I also see that I'm called to be with my family more than I am today, just on the weekends. The kids are growing up, when they're small, mom maybe can take care of them, but then they become teenagers, and they need somebody to lay the law down, because, swinging the belt, you need some muscle sometimes." Right, guys? Everybody that's grown up in a strict family, you know how it feels. Giving you a little PTSD flashbacks right now. But sometimes it needs to happen. But he says, on the other side, it seems as my business is doing well as well, and I'm providing for the family, and we're making money, until he says, I begin to clearly see God begins to speak to me. And his truck and trailer, by the way, those of you that are truck drivers, freezer, so those were expensive, get stolen in LA. Completely with the load and everything. That's several hundred, I would estimate $300,000 worth of equipment and load gone. He's got no place else to work. He sits at home for a month until they find the truck, another month until they find the trailer, obviously empty. He goes back to work. Now he's trying to make up lost time because he's got to make payments on the truck. Then all of a sudden, this lady just rams him, like T-bones a truck on her car, and then he's got to deal with all that and the lawsuit and stay home, and it's obviously her fault, but he's got to deal with that before he can get back on the road. And then a few months go by, he's finally back on the road, and one night they're driving under this overpass, and some guy on like a big pickup truck completely loses his axle, loses the wheel, the shock, the whole deal. It comes coming down off the overpass, hits the ditch, bounces up, slams into the side of the truck, almost kills his co-driver. They find the thing, it bounced off and was like way, way, way down the road. Still, that's how much energy it had. I mean, one thing after another, and he says, I heard God speaking to me. He left the transportation business, as lucrative as it was, and went to work for minimum wage in construction. The other job you can do without, being proficient in English. It was very, very tough. I mean, the pay that he would take home was like 30% of what he was making before. That's a tough decision. Those of you that are dads here, men, I mean, think about taking like a 70% haircut, right? And haircut, I mean just in salary, like done. You're just at a portion of what you used to make before. And my mom had to go to work. But he knew at the end of it all that he was with his family every night. He was in ministry whenever he needed to be. And God just rewarded him in that respect. And he pastored that church now, and he pastors it still. And so many of the young people that he worked with, now that he had that time, were saved. And as well as his family, now he had that time to spend with them. Men, I know we are so driven and so competitive. And I speak for myself right now, and I think, man, I want to do it my way. I want to succeed. I see how the other men are doing. I want to do as good or better. I want to provide I'm going to invest all my time into work. I'm going to do this. And we sacrifice our time with our families so many times when God says, no, I want you to be back here more. I want you to be the leader more. I want you to obey me first. You're praying for your kids' soul, and then you don't spend any time with them. I need you to obey first. And you can see the official here got the same reward. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. And so he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. And he himself believed, and all his household. And this was now the second sign that Jesus did when he came from Judea to Galilee. Folks, here's what happened. His faith gets strengthened through that. And then his household looks at dad and says, we have a dad that is obedient to Scripture. We have a dad that takes his guidance from above. We have a dad that is willing to sacrifice everything for us. And he believes. And then following his example, they say, now we will also believe. That is somebody we can follow. We'll follow dad's example. His whole family was saved. I don't know where the Lord is calling you to obedience, to sacrifice. He could have easily said to Jesus, I'm not leaving you until you're coming with me. I'm an official. Who do you think you are, and do you know who I am? But he obeyed. I don't know, dads, what the Lord is calling you to obey in. I don't know, folks, if you want to think about what your dads and just the appreciation where they have shown obedience to God. Many of us are here because our dads obeyed God in some form or fashion. I gave you my example, you know yours. God calls two dads and said, before I do a miracle in your life, I want obedience. There was another dad later on in Jesus' ministry. We're going to read about him as well. If you guys can, open up to Mark. Open up to Mark, chapter 5. There we go. Jesus tested the official for his obedience, and then he's going to test a man called Jairus for his patience. For his patience. Men, do we need patience? Most of the time. A lot of times. You guys know the story of Jairus. If we open up Mark 5:22, we read it often. It's the leader of the synagogue that comes to Jesus and says, I want you to heal my daughter. And so I want to talk about the man Jairus a little bit. Did I say Jairus before? I meant Jairus. When you're a leader of a synagogue in a town like Capernaum, because everybody that reads the story, we believe that this was where it was. We actually were in Capernaum. This is part of the Israel trip that we did. This is the synagogue in Capernaum, one of the oldest surviving synagogues to this day. This is not the synagogue that was there during the time of Jesus. It's a very nice one, but if you go to the next picture, this is how it looks like from the air. Beautiful, beautiful synagogue. The synagogue that would have been there around the time of Jesus is actually underneath it. They've dug down and below, and they know that there's a foundation for an older synagogue underneath. That is literally, when we talk about where Jairus would have been the leader of the synagogue, it would have been in this synagogue right here, right underneath this one. Jesus lived in Capernaum for a while. Did you guys know that? So when we read that story about Jairus, Jesus would have known him. It was not like he's walking through another town and this leader of the synagogue and, oh, by the way, his name was Jairus. No, the reason we have his name here is because they knew each other. In fact, if you go to the next picture, they lived very close to each other. It's kind of tough to see, but where those trees are in the upper right-hand corner, that's where the synagogue is. You can see all that white. You guys with me? Literally like 3 inches over, not in real life, but on the picture, there's that tall structure, kind of a gray roof that you guys see. That's a Catholic church that was built on top of the remains of what they believe to be Peter's house where Jesus lived. Jairus and Jesus probably lived a couple of blocks away from each other. Not something, I was kind of stunned when I began to research this. They would have known each other. In fact, Jesus preached in that synagogue that Jairus was the leader of. We read that here, it's in Scripture. Mark chapter 1, very early on, and apparently more and more times, they were in Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught, and they were, probably Jairus as well, astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And then there was a man there that needed healing, and after the healing, they were all amazed. They kept on asking one another, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Jairus would have been there. And he would have probably debated with this new teacher, this Jesus guy that's come to town, and he's settling in. Who are you? What kind of teaching are you bringing? It's so new, it's so fresh, it's so powerful. But yet, we also know that Jairus was not a believer. We understand that in John chapter 7:47, there's even a phrase the Pharisees said, have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or Pharisees believed in him? The ruling class of especially those that were in ministry, the scribes, the Pharisees obviously, would not have believed in Jesus as God. They would have seen him as a teacher that was making statements that were very dubious, and obviously some would say he's an outright heretic, and especially as you went down into to Jerusalem, they wanted to outright kill him, right? But Jairus would have known Jesus, and he would have not believed in Jesus, even though he was seeing these miracles happening right before his eyes. Now, now that we know the setting, going back to Mark, earlier that day, Jesus is preaching. Early that morning, he's preaching on the beach there. If you guys could go back to the picture real quick, you can see all of this was, keep going back a little, there we go. There we go. You can see it's right there on the water. That's the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus, in the beginning of this chapter, was preaching right there on the coast. And we read the crowds were around him, pushing him into the water. So he says, hey, Peter, roll up your boat. We're going to preach from the boat. And then after he's done preaching, they remember the story. They go across the sea to the area called Gadara, where he heals a demon-possessed man. And then that evening, they're returning back. The crowds would have listened to him in the morning. They would have went and done their own business during the day. And then come evening time, they're waiting for Jesus to come back. They're waiting for him. But this time, amongst that crowd, we have Jairus. Something happened. Something happened over the last 24 hours that now Jairus is waiting for Jesus. And as Jesus comes back into port and lands there on the beach, we read Mark 5:22, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. You guys all know this story. He comes and begs of Jesus. Guys, it was not a long walk. You can see how close they were to the water. That's a 2-minute walk on a slow day. But then as Jesus begins to head in that direction, the woman touches him, and there's another healing that happens there in Capernaum. And in all the commotion of that, it's almost too late. You can imagine Jairus standing there as, all right, Jesus, let's go. I know you know me, you know we've had these conversations before. Jairus, on his side, has been waiting. His girl it's not like she got sick yesterday, right? She's been sick for a while. And he's refused to go to Jesus because he doesn't believe. And so he's tried everything else. And he's brought the doctors in, and they've prayed over her with the ministers, and they've done this and that. And now, in the last 24 hours of her life, something goes from bad to worse. She gets sicker and sicker. And he realizes then, during that day that Jesus is away, that she's about to die. His little girl is on the brink of death. And so when Jesus comes back, he's ready. All right, this time I surrender. All right, hopefully this is the Son of God. And so he's waiting there for Jesus on the beach. Jesus comes in. He's like, let's go, let's go, let's go. And then this woman stops Jesus, and she's trying to get healing. And he's saying, Jesus, come on. You can heal her another time. My little girl's about to die. Let's go. You know me? You know me. Let's go. Stop treating me like I'm nobody. Stop. I'm not a second-class citizen. Why are you giving miracles to other people and not to me? I need that salvation right now. I need your help right now. But Jesus seems to delay and delay and delay. It's a 2-minute walk, Jesus. It's not supposed to take a half hour. And Jesus seems to delay, and he's talking, and who touched me, and healing. And the exasperation grows. This girl's about to die. A pastor gets a call one night. A young couple, the dad calls and says, hey, I need you to come over here right now. I know it's midnight, but our baby just died in an unfortunate accident. We just need you to be with us and console us. He hops in the car, drives over there as quickly as he can. They lived in this apartment complex. He parks the car, and he says, I didn't even need to ask for directions to where their apartment was. I could hear the cry of the mom, inconsolable. From across the parking lot, I knew exactly where they were. Where there was pain, where there was anguish. And I think that cry would have reached the ears of Jairus before even the messenger did. That pain, the weeping of the mom who realized she just lost her daughter, the screams, they would have heard them first, and then only the messenger arrives to Jairus and says, hey, don't bother the teacher anymore. It's too late. She's gone. What a test for Jairus in that moment. Man, I finally decide to surrender to you. I finally decide to believe in this Jesus, and he takes too long. And yet the whole time, Jesus was testing him for patience. Verse 36, but overhearing what they said, Jesus says to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, Jairus. Only believe. Jairus, I don't want you to make excuses afterwards that, oh, you know what? Maybe she was getting better and like, Jesus, you just kind of were there. I don't want you to have any doubt. I don't want you to think that this happened by accident. You're going to believe today. You've started that journey, and I'm going to help you along the way. No excuses. This is going to be for the glory of God. I need you to see that I am God incarnate. And he allowed no one to follow him in except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And Jesus saw the commotion, the people weeping and wailing loudly. They've been hearing it from a few blocks away, but now they're there. And he says to them, what are you making a commotion weeping about? The child's not dead, it's sleeping. Listen, this is going to be so short, so quick. It's going to be like a little nap for her. And they laughed at him. And so he says, all right, you doubters, get outside then. Sometimes that's what you've got to do. Take that doubt and says, get out. Throws them out of the house. Took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in there where the child was, and taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome in amazement. Where there is patience, there is payoff. Where there is patience, there is payoff. I think so many times, dads, men, parents, anybody that's a believer, I think we get into that mindset. Why aren't you paying attention to me, God? Life is so tough. I've been asking you for this. I finally surrendered, all right? I've forsaken, I've given up this sin. I've stopped doing that other thing. All right, Lord, finally come do something in my life. I'm ready to surrender. I'm ready to allow you to do something here. And God seems to take his time. And he doesn't react immediately. And you think, hurry up. It's tough. It's painful. And he seems to take his time, and he tests us in patience. Man, if you're thinking about your dad right now, he's been tested through that patience. It's been some tough nights for your parents. If you're a dad today, maybe that's been already in your life where you're thinking, my kids are in a wrong place right now. They're in a bad, bad place. And I need you to do a miracle right now. God, please. And God says, I'm going to test you on your patience right now. I'm going to test you on your obedience first. But now I'm also going to test you on your patience. And finally, we're going to read another story, also in Mark chapter 9, about another father. The first one was an official. This one was a leader of the synagogue. This one was just a simple dad. We don't read a lot about him. We don't know a lot about his story, but he also was going to come to Jesus and beg for his kids and beg for his son. Mark chapter 9, he comes, I think, early in the morning. Earlier in this chapter, we see Jesus has gone up to the Mount of Transfiguration, and that probably happened at night up on the mount, and they're waiting for Jesus to come back down, and this man comes with his son to look for Jesus early in the morning, possibly trying to avoid the crowds. His son had a problem as well. He wasn't dying, he wasn't ill. We read here he was demon-possessed. The symptoms seemed to be like an illness. He was deaf sometimes, mute sometimes. He had seizures. But then there were other things that really showed that the problem was deeper. He would seize up and become paralyzed, and then suddenly the Spirit would lead him to jump in the fire or in the water. Luke even says, as a doctor, he described it as it shatters him. Man, can you imagine as a father, maybe as a sibling today, looking into the eyes of your child, and in those moments, something else is looking back at you? I don't know how his kid got into this situation. That area was known, that northern part of Israel, far north of the Sea of Galilee. There was a lot of paganism that was brought in by the Roman occupation. This was an example of where we were again in our trip, where this was again in Israel. The Romans built a temple for, I believe that's Zeus, and then Pan over there on the left-hand side. That was a whole temple for Pan, where there was an underground stream that they would butcher a goat and throw it in there, and if the goat washed out, then that meant certain things, or if it didn't reappear. And so this goat carcass that was this part of this ritual, there was a lot of that in Israel at that time. There were gods. If you see the next picture we took, they had these. That's Miss Lily Shamry, if she's here, shout out. Thank you for modeling where the idols used to stand. But that's where they were. And they would have these enclaves built into the rock, and they would put the idols there and worship and do all kinds of rituals. There was a lot of that going on in that area. And somehow this dad messed up, didn't check on his kids. Somehow, maybe it was the wrong company. Whatever that happened, this kid got into all of this, we assume, and now, by some circumstance, he was possessed. And so the father brings them early in the morning to the base of the mountain. You can see a picture here. We believe that this is where it was, the base of the Mount of Transfiguration. There at the bottom, so that nobody would see the embarrassment that his family had to deal with. This failure as a father, he would have seen it as, and he brings them, but Jesus wasn't there that morning. He was still on the mountain. And we can see in Mark 9 that there was a crowd that had gathered already, and the disciples were there, so he runs to the disciples like, all right, guys, can you just really quickly help me out here finally? And the disciples couldn't do it, and now the Pharisees get involved, and now it's an argument, and there's more people gathering, and everybody's getting frustrated, but he just wants healing for his son. Luke says it was his only child. Mark 9:15, all of a sudden Jesus comes down. They see him walking down the corner, the slope of the mountain, maybe comes around the corner in the bend. And Mark 9:15, when the whole crowd saw him, they were immediately overcome with awe. They ran forward to greet him, and he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And somebody from the crowd answered him, Man, I've been waiting for you for a while here, Jesus. Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. Whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams, and he grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so. Jesus commands the boy be brought to him. You can imagine that picture as he comes forward, maybe pushed out from the crowd. A young boy, maybe 12, 13 years old. Burn marks on his body and face, just exhausted and thin from all that he's been through, eyes averted from the shame of it all. And then he sees Jesus, and it strikes again. And dashes him on the ground, and he's foaming now and screaming. And the father's getting more frustrated and embarrassed by the second. And Jesus doesn't heal the boy right away. All of this is happening. The people see it. His family's just it's shameful for him to display this before the crowds, before the leaders of that time. And Jesus seems to just stand there and begin to analyze it. And he turns to the father and says, "Oh, how long has this been happening to him?" And we think, "Come on, Jesus, you know how long this has been happening to him. You're the Son of God. Come on, just get on with it." But I read in this question something else. I think what happened was, again, as this was close to the end of Jesus' ministry, I think when he turned to the dad and he looked him in the eyes, and it was a deeper question when he said, "Hey, how long has this been happening to him?" This didn't start yesterday, did it? It wasn't last week, was it? And the dad admits, yeah, it's been since childhood. Folks, I think the implicit question here to this man was this. He says, "You know I've been through these parts. You know about my ministry." This is towards the end of his ministry, 3.5 years of walking around, casting out demons, healing people, helping families get healing. You knew about that. I've made myself available. Everybody else came to me. How long has this guy been sick? Since childhood. What's wrong with you? What stopped you from coming to me before? There's people that walk for days to see me. Why now? And in the same, it was a question of the man's faith. It was a question of why did you not believe before? And you can see the man replies, he says, "Well, Lord, if you can heal him," and Jesus has to stop him, "If you can, if I can. You brought him to me now and you still don't believe." And he just confronts him on that. Even as his son is suffering through it, he says, "I'm not going to do a thing until you and I have a conversation, Dad. We're going to talk first before I do anything in your life. This was a mistake, and we're going to correct it right now because the mistake is first of all in you. If you can, do you not know all things are possible for those that believe?" Men, be real right now. We let pride get in the way too much. We let pride get in the way too much. I get the beautiful opportunity to meet with parents on occasion in that partnership of, hey, how do we help our kids? And my son's doing this, my daughter's doing that. How do we come together to help bring them back to the truth? For whatever reason, probably 70%, 75% of those conversations are with the mom. And rarely is it with the dad. Why is it the mom that comes and says, "We need help now. We're ready to talk about this"? And the dad seems to be a little slower on the uptake. I was talking to a pastor once, and we kind of got into that discussion of how do you deal with parents of youth, and he says, man, fathers, dads, the husbands, the men, he says, are the toughest to deal with sometimes. He says, there's so much pride. He relayed to me a story of somebody who was trying to counsel. He says, I've been talking to this guy. He comes to church, this dad, older now. His kids are all grown up in their mid-20s at least. And he comes to church and he plays the part of the believer. And then he goes home and he's such a terrible dad. He's abusive. He's a terrible spiritual example. He tries to be strict to them, but he's not strict to himself. I mean, all of his kids have left the church because of him. And parents, kids don't leave the church because you're strict to them. They leave the church because you're not strict to yourself first. When there's hypocrisy, that's when they leave the church. And so he says, I'm trying to talk to him and tell him that you did wrong. You need to apologize to your kids first things first. If you love them, that's what you must do. And he said his pride won't let him do it. To this day, he says he won't do it. Well, I have every right as a father to do what I did. And his pride won't let him overcome that. I think that's the situation that's happening here. A man that was too proud to go to Jesus earlier. Oh, yeah, everybody else did, but we'll handle it in our family. We keep our business to ourselves. No need to air out the dirty laundry. We'll take care of it. We don't need Jesus in on this. And finally, something happened. Something wore him down enough where he comes to Jesus, and now Jesus is calling him out. He says, how long has this been going on for? And the man feels inside of him, this guy, this dad, begins to realize his mistake. And Jesus is testing him here. He says, I need you to submit. This is a test of submission. And finally, he can only reply when Jesus says, do you realize that anything is possible to those that believe? He replies, I believe, help my unbelief. What an admission. I'm at fault, Lord. My belief is not strong. Help my unbelief. I held out for too long. I made the situation worse. But now I believe. Now I truly surrender to you. I surrender myself. I surrender my idols. I surrender everything that's been going on in my family that's made this happen to begin with. I surrender all of that. I'm finally ready to believe. Help my unbelief. Verse 25, and when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him, never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the body was like a corpse, so that most of them said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. When the father surrenders, when the head of the household surrenders, only then did Jesus act in his family. Only then did Jesus cast out the demon. Only then did he bring that healing. He's casting out the demon in the child, but he's also casting out unbelief in the father. The man that thought he could handle it all himself, he thought he could take care of things. Jesus says you can't. Admit defeat. Take pride out of the equation. It's just you and me. I need you to surrender first. I'm going to test you in that before I bring you an answer. 3 different dads that came to Jesus. And Jesus tests them in obedience, in patience, in surrender. And I think that's such a lesson for me in knowing that as a future dad, I'm going to be tested in all of those. Many of the dads here, you've been through that. You've been through maybe some of these, maybe all of these. If you're thinking about your dads, understand that the Lord does test them, and appreciate the fact that they've been through this test, that they've been praying and seeking God through all of this. Each one of these men that came to God, to Christ, was asked to believe. Each one of them was questioned on their faith. One of them brought his child to Christ. One brought Christ to his child, and one could only bring himself. And Jesus answered all of them. And that's a promise to the fathers today. Maybe in faith today, you can bring your kids to church and bring them to the Lord here. Maybe in faith today, you can live the life of Christ before your kids and bring Christ to them. Maybe in faith today, all you can do is come to Christ yourself and just pray for them and surrender yourself before him. And Christ can answer All of the above. What a lesson for us. I just want to encourage the dads today that as you see this, all of this was answered. There is a promise, there is an answer, there is a solution, there is healing on the other side of all of this. But I failed in that. He understands. He understands. Come to him and say, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. My unbelief caused this. But let my belief now bring healing going forward. Give me an answer even though it had been a long time coming. I want to conclude with this story and ask the band to come up. A story shared by Dwight L. Moody, a great evangelist. It was told to him by somebody he met at one of his revivals, and he continued to tell it. Such a powerful story about a father and a son. The son was sick, very sick. In fact, they knew he was going to die. There was nothing the doctors could do anymore. They let him home. They let him go home to die with and surrounded by family and support. Obviously, this was a little long time ago when they didn't have the medicine we have today, but the kid's dying. And the father, obviously, he's trying to be with him. One evening, he comes into the room, knowing that the boy was weak, needed his attention. He comes in when he hears him kind of groaning, and he approaches the bed. The son, what can I do for you? And all the son can do, he's having trouble breathing. He says, Dad, lift me up a little bit. And so the dad comes in and kind of gets his hands under his head and lifts him up a little bit to help him breathe better. And he says, no, Dad, higher. And so the dad picks him up a little higher, and the son says, no, higher still. And so he picks him up higher, and he says, no, still higher. And so he's now kind of holding him there in the vertical position. You can imagine, all wasted away, no meat on his bones, just almost a skeleton of a child trying to breathe. He says, I held him for as long as I could until finally I had to let him down, but by then he was no longer breathing. The dad shares this story with Dr. Moody, and he says, Dr. Moody, in that moment, as painful as it was to lose my son, I knew that we had taught him well. I knew that he had seen our faith. I knew that he had faith himself. I felt in that moment as if I had just given him right into the hands of God, passed him right up, lifted him right up, and let him pass into eternity. I had that faith. I had that confidence. I had passed that test. Folks, that's the encouragement I want to leave to the dads today, but I also want to speak to the kids and say, show appreciation to your fathers today. There's so much prayer that happens behind the scene. There's so much that was done for you to lift you up, to bring you into the presence of God, to bring you into faith. So many tests of faith that were passed. Show some appreciation. Just take a second right now. I'm going to ask the band not to play right away, or you guys can keep playing, but not to sing right away. And just take time. You guys can play though. I like the tunes. But I want you to take, just even sitting down right now, just a couple of minutes, get your phone out and just text them something. And show some appreciation and knowing that they've had to display that obedience and been tested for patience and been tested in their surrender. And maybe they passed and maybe they didn't. But show that appreciation. And if you don't have a dad today, send a text to your mom, because she's been through the same. And say, thank you for coming to the Lord for me. And if your parents don't receive text because they're old, call them after you get out, all right? I'm going to give you a second right now.